Hello, my name is Julie Newlan, Pro Vice-Chancellor for Business and International Development at the University of Hertfordshire. And it's an absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to my conversation with one of our local MPs, Bim Afolami, as part of our Festival of Ideas. Bim was elected MP for Hitchen and Harpenden in 2017, and alongside his work as a constituency MP, he is also the Parliamentary Private Secretary for Therese Coffey, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. Bim was educated at Eton and studied modern history at Oxford. As well as being Vice President for the Oxford Union and playing football for the university, he then pursued a successful career in the city, first as a corporate lawyer and then as a senior executive at HSBC. He is married to Hetty and they have 3 small boys. In any spare time between politics and children, he plays cricket and reads history books. And I would add that what really comes across in both your biography and also your interviews is your enthusiasm and drive to take advantage of opportunities, which I think will come out in this conversation. To start our conversation, I wondered if you could talk about how you feel the local community has responded to the pandemic.
Well, thanks very much for that, Julian. It's a pleasure to join you. How do I think about the local community and its response? I think that, like in common with lots of communities across the country, the community's responded very well. We're lucky in Hertfordshire to be, it's a reasonably affluent community in most parts of the county, especially in my constituency, but not exclusively so. There are people who give up, who've donated money and their time to help with those who are shielding, those who can't get out, everything from shopping to making sure that they don't get lonely, that there's connection. There's so many groups that have been set up in different villages and towns to make sure that people can get through this together a bit more easily, because it's challenging for everybody of whatever age or whatever type of life that people have. What I would also say is that businesses have done a really good job. Yeah. I expected lots of people to have been made unemployed by this stage, and by all means that has happened, especially in people who work in the retail sector or events or hospitality. But the vast majority of businesses have done whatever they could, taken salary cuts, done whatever they can so that they don't make people unemployed. And I think that is really important as well. So I think the local communities have responded very well.
Yes, thank you. Is there anything that stands out as a particular highlight for you, Bim? I mean, I know for us at the university, it was watching our final year the midwives and the nurses, the paramedics that were about to graduate, being so excited actually about the opportunity to help and to be allowed to go in and make a real difference as the processes were changed to accelerate those people into the NHS. And I mean that was really heartwarming for us. It's something that really stood out for me. Is there anything that you feel stood out for you?
Gosh, I think for me personally, and I don't want to this is very much what I myself have seen.
Yes.
There were grants made to small businesses that at the beginning of the crisis, particularly those were focused around pubs and businesses that were forced, not just pubs, but businesses that were forced to shut by law, by operation of the law, so that they could pay their rent and survive. But there were lots of businesses that weren't covered by those original grants. And I worked very hard with the Treasury and Bays. Once I found out from 2 of my local councils that there was a huge underspend on the money that had originally been given by the government to councils to give these grants. And I thought, hold on, we've got to use this money because otherwise it would just get returned back to central government. and that they could, and that I worked very hard with HMT and Bays so that they could retain a 5% of that underspend to give in discretionary grants to other businesses. Right. And I had a young woman who started her osteopathy business in Hitchen, who had been really suffering before these grants. And it was that, combined with speaking to the council, that actually made me then go off to Treasury and Bays to get this fixed. And MHCLG, the Communities Department. Long story short, once it got done and eventually the money got out, though it happened more slowly than I'd have liked, I sent her a note, and then she sent me a note saying, the business I think can survive. And actually that's really, it's no personal cost to me, it's no personal cost to anybody, but that is a huge thing. And those sorts of things, and I know that because I've been in touch with her, but there have been many others whose businesses would survive because of that. So for me, that was a real highlight.
That's really, really interesting. What do you feel then that the way that we've all behaved and the way we've had to adapt, what do you think it's told us about the strengths of our community, Bim?
Well, I think it actually shows strengths and weaknesses, right? So I talked about the strengths before in terms of community cohesion, remembering that none of us are islands and we live in little groups of people, and how a sustainable life is mutual support networks that go beyond your immediate family. And I think that's very important for everybody to remember, even if they didn't, most people knew that, but it's good to be reminded of this. I don't think I've heard this too often, and politicians don't always ever say anything negative, but I do think it's worth saying. The thing I haven't liked about this, beyond nobody likes being locked up, I get that, myself included. The thing I haven't liked is that slightly the culture whereby sometimes in the early phase of the lockdown, I was getting emails to my office saying, so-and-so from across the road has been out twice. They're only allowed to go out once. Yes. And I just sort of thought, this is really terrible. That the culture of sort of wanting to snitch on people's neighbours. I think that was a really, really negative aspect to human beings more generally that I don't want to see repeated. And I just do not think is what, as a country and as a society, we should be about. And I know it was happening because I was getting emails and people saying, can you send this to the police? And I said, well, no. I'm not going to do it. I don't believe that that's now, I'm not saying that was widespread, but of course you don't need it to be widespread. You just need one person on the street to be like that. Yes. And that actually affects the culture. And I do think that was a negative aspect that came out in the earlier phases. I don't think that's there anymore, but I do think that negative aspect we need to watch and make sure that as a society we become mutually supportive. And I know there'll be those who say, oh, but they were doing the wrong thing. Well, actually people all have different situations and people try and do the right thing, and people have very particular circumstances, and no rule can cover every circumstance. And I just think we've got to be understanding about that and not treat it as a way of sort of negatively punishing people for transgressing, because largely 99% of people are trying to do the right thing all the time. They're just trying to make the right judgment.
That's really interesting. Yes, I always felt that we all had to just do the best that we could, and that's sometimes different, isn't it? So it leads me actually, interestingly, to the next question, which was, what can we learn from the impact of the pandemic on us? And in some ways, that would be a big lesson, perhaps, Bim, that you would say to us, that we have to learn to be perhaps a little kinder about other people's circumstances.
Exactly. So I think that accepting that everybody has very difficult circumstances and not judging and prejudging that, I think is very, very important. Secondly, I think that the importance of nature, the importance of, despite the fact that as human beings, we think we are masters of all we survey, we are not. We are only subject to what the earth allows us to do and nature allows us to do. And I don't want to be too theological about it, but that remembering that balance, and I think particularly when we think of climate change as well, there is part of the human psyche that basically thinks any challenge we can fix. And look, I'm an optimistic person. You have to be optimistic if you're in politics. I'm an optimistic person, so I tend towards this. But you can only do that within the constraints of nature. You can do that within the constraints that you're, and it makes me think of I think it was Mark Twain, and they said, what should you invest in? And he said, I'm paraphrasing, I'm probably butchering the quote, but he basically said, what should you do with your money, or what should you invest in? And he said, land. They're not making it anymore. And why I say that is, there are certain things that human beings, you cannot buck nature. So I think that has really reminded us, this whole pandemic has really reminded us, despite all of our undoubted brilliance as a species, nature is incredibly important and occasionally reminds us that it is.
Gosh, yes, that's very humbling, isn't it, really, Bim? Yes.
Yes, and for a politician, being humble is a tough thing to be.
If we could turn now perhaps to business, and this pandemic has had a huge impact, particularly in our county, in Hertfordshire. How do you see us growing as we recover? Where do you see our strengths, and how Hertfordshire might turn itself to recovery?
So there are a few parts to this. So in terms of business generally, I published a report recently that got a lot of coverage, which is called Unlock Britain. And one of the main ideas in it that I've been working on with various people in the business community and City of London, locally in Hertfordshire, and people like Adrian Hawkins with the LEP and various other people, is to recapitalize small and medium-sized businesses after this, as we come out of this crisis, because a large number of them have too much debt, and we have to reduce that debt burden and give them equity so that they can power forward growth. But that's a national thing, and that would happen across the whole UK. But in Hertfordshire, of course, that would benefit. If you focus it particularly on Hertfordshire, the truth is this: Hertfordshire, part of Hertfordshire, looks and feels in business terms like London. Part of Hertfordshire is effectively it's what you might almost describe as an endogenous economy. It serves the people who live in the particular locality. And then part of it, like somewhere like Stevenage, is nationally or regionally important, but it's not dependent per se on being close to London. A lot of the aerospace industry, for example, Stevenage, if Stevenage was 50 miles north, it would still be those businesses would still be situated there. So Hertfordshire has a very, very funny economy. It sort of has three economies in one. I think if you look at the next 5, 10, 15 years, the biggest trend is going to be people moving out of bigger cities and into, to live, I'm talking about, and into places like Hertfordshire. Now, that's going to put a big pressure on population, in addition to the pressures that we had already. So we're going to have to plan and think very carefully about that, because, and again, something politicians are never meant to say in Hertfordshire, in county constituencies, lots of villages, you're never meant to say that houses need to be built. They're going to have to be built. And we're going to have to think very carefully about how we build them, make sure we build sustainable communities. And what I mean by sustainable is not sustainable in the environmental sense, though that's important. I mean sustainable in terms of business, because what will follow that trend with people moving to places like Hertfordshire and Buckinghamshire and Leicestershire and Norfolk and Cambridgeshire is people are going to want to set up businesses locally. And we need to make sure that they have the space to do that. They're going to have the people, because I think you're going to have an outflow from London, but they're going to need the space. So when we build homes and communities and garden villages and all those things, for example, in Harlow, the big expansion there, when we do that, we're going to have to make sure we think about the sustainability of those things in economic terms, not just build huge dormitory towns, assuming everybody's working in London, because I think that we've probably reached the peak of that. And then over the coming years, that will start to drop.
Just a closing question, Bim. What would you say to us all in terms of being optimistic as we go forward this year? Reasons to be cheerful.
Reasons to be cheerful. So I believe that the bounce back in economic terms is going to be quicker and stronger than is currently discussed. But the downside of that is that I think that there's going to be a lag in terms of the job recovery. So there are two aspects, of course, to economic growth. You have the overall revenue of companies, which drives GDP, revenue of companies and consumer spending, which drives GDP. And then, of course, you've got employment. Now, those things are not entirely contiguous. So what I think you're likely to get is that our businesses start to bounce back. And look, I advise businesses, in addition to being an MP, my wife runs a family business. I speak to business people all the time. I'm starting to see that bouncing back happening. And I think it's happening faster than people realize. But I'm not convinced that people employ as many people as they did, at least in the short term. And that means we are going to have to deal with unemployment as a problem, which is something we haven't seen really since the early 90s. But the optimism comes because I think people are going to realize that there are huge opportunities and there'll be a reallocation of where people work and what they do that will actually be beneficial. I think that there are going to be huge opportunities there. And I think that that will be important. I also think it's going to be an opportunity in the way we live in our villages and in our towns. Because if we can really use this opportunity to make local community transport and transport across Hertfordshire much easier and more effective, that is really, really important. Because the Hertfordshire transport economy is designed in large part to get people in and out of London. To get across Hertfordshire is quite tricky. If you're going from Hertford, say, the capital of the county, to Markyate, near Bedfordshire on the other side, as the crow flies, it's probably no more than 15, 16 miles, something like that. Maybe more, 20. But to actually do that journey is a real pain. And you have to go in and around, Hitchen, and we have to think about how we can do this more effectively. That's going to be light rail, it's going to be buses, it's going to be locally much more cycling and walking in a very local way. I mean, people aren't going to walk from Markyate to Hertford, but they might walk around Hertford a bit more. They might cycle around Hertford a bit more. So working out how that's going to happen in our towns and villages is very important. I also think that this is also an opportunity for how we deal with local government. I believe that strengthening smaller institutions of government, parishes, town councils, that's very, very important. And then giving strategic powers much more to county. I think that combination of having stronger local powers, so if you live in Harpenden, the Harpenden Town Council does wonderful things, but they don't control parking. Sort of bonkers. Harpenden Town Council should control parking. But planning, when you're thinking of roads and education and transport, should be handled by county. So again, I think that this presents us a lot of opportunity, which means that people will have more control over their lives and the communities in which they live. And I think that that's a good thing.
Thank you very much, Bim, for sharing your thoughts. We realise you are very busy. These are truly extraordinary times, but it's been really encouraging to hear your thoughts on our world at present and how our community has come together and how the future looks. We really appreciate it. Thank you for having a conversation.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you.
Thank you, Bim.